But yes, moderating the event this evening is the delightful Michelle Sterling. She is the New York Times bestselling author of Camp Zero. Born and raised in British Columbia, Canada, she is now our neighbor over in Cambridge and teaches creative writing and literature at Berklee College of Music. Her writing has been translated into 10 languages, so thank you for being here today. And the author we are all here to celebrate this evening is the incredible Caroline Woods. She is the author of Fräulein N. and The Lunar Housewife, which received acclaim from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Today Show, Book Page, Publishers Weekly, Crime Reads, and Read with Jenna Community, and so many more. As a Pushcart Prize nominee, Caroline has taught creative writing at Loyola University Chicago, Boston University, and the Boston Conservatory. She has loved scary stories, little-known history, and the supernatural since she was very small, and these things blend perfectly together for the newest book, which we are celebrating today, which is, of course, The Mesmerist. The Mesmerist is a tightly plotted page-turner ripped from the headlines of history as three very different women must work together to stop a killer and save the truest home they've ever known. So I know y'all are just as eager as me to hear these speakers speak, so help me welcome to the story.
Okay. I'll start by reading. I'm just going to read. Can everybody hear me? Good. I'll read just the first page of it. Okay. All right, chapter 1, Abby. The poor young woman, the one everyone would take to calling the ghost girl, or worse, in a matter of weeks, found her way to the Bethany home for unwed mothers by walking the railroad tracks. Later, this would be one of the things that made the other girls suspicious. Could someone in her condition, if she really was in said condition, traipse at least 5 miles in the sticky humidity of a growing thunderstorm, in a heavy satin gown, no less? In Abby's view, the new arrival's trek didn't imply dishonesty. It suggested desperation. The thunderstorm, with all the crackling friction it gathered in the air and the impressive black anvil cloud over southern Minneapolis, ended up petering out into nearly nothing. Just one bright streak of lightning at around 3 that Sunday afternoon, followed by a powder keg boom. Abby Mendenhall, treasurer and board member of the Sisterhood of Bethany, paid a railway switch operator to watch the comings and goings of the First Avenue red light district and report back to her. Which brothel was the current mayor's favorite? Which madams were trading girls down the river to St. Paul? Who had been raided by the police? Later, the switch operator told her he'd seen what he called a banshee, picking her way over the railroad tracks about 10 minutes before the crack of thunder. He had shouted at the girl to watch herself. He was Catholic, an immigrant from one of the Slavic countries. He'd crossed himself when she turned and he saw her face. But I didn't see no face, he reported to Abby, his hands trembling. She looked at me and it seemed there was no face there. Or as soon as I saw it, I forgot it. All I remember is she wore purple. Abel Stevens, who owned a small dairy barn just around the corner from the Bethany home on East Lake, saw a wave coming toward him at the instant when veins of lightning split the sky. He'd known immediately something was wrong. She wore no hat or gloves, and her hair hung ragged and loose. Her skin glowed as pale as the lightning, as if something had scared the color from it. Abel had wanted to help her, but his wife stood beside him on the curb as they emptied buckets of slop. His eyes had met his wife's. Both knew what that garish purple gown meant. His wife splashed her bucket violently, drenching the girl's high-heeled boots as she passed them. Then, boom, the thunder. Stevens flinched. When he opened his eyes, she was gone. As for Abby, she'd been in the Bethany home's parlor with Mrs. Van Cleve and the 2 male callers when the storm made its one announcement. She delayed her tea until 3 so that she could accommodate these 2 fancy gentlemen in their brightly patterned waistcoats, the gold chains of their pocket watches gleaming. Okay, I'll stop there.
Such a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Caroline. We've known each other for
A long time.
a while. Yeah, we go back, and it's like I am such a an admirer of your work. And actually, listening to you read the first page and a half reminded me of a novel I hadn't actually thought of in relation to your work, which is The Transit of Venus by Shirley Hazard, which has all about sort of ideas of like fate and free will and our lives, destined. Can we actually have culpability? And I was actually wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit about that before we set the stage of the actual historical bit of the novel.
Sure. I mean, I think you really did touch on a theme of this book. It's called The Mesmerist, and one of the ideas that I'm playing with in this book is how people can create a scapegoat when they want to deny responsibility for their own actions. Mesmerists were considered like powerful people who could bend others' will to their own. And I wanted to look into the ways that if you felt that there was somebody like that in your midst, how would your behavior change based on your ability then to shift blame onto somebody else?
Yeah, I think there's so much of the book that sort of very coyly subverts romantic tropes as well, and I won't touch more upon that like later in the conversation. But for those who haven't had the immense pleasure of reading The Mesmerist yet, can you set the stage for us? Like 1894, Minneapolis, turn of the century. What's like sort of the historical precedent for this book, and why were you so interested in diving into it?
Sure. So I looked into Gilded Age stories. I knew I wanted to write something set in the Gilded Age, but I wasn't sure where it would take place. And I decided to look away from, our better known Gilded Age stories in like New York or Newport, Rhode Island, and look toward the Midwest, which is where I live now. And I started to find records of women who were working really hard to bridge the massive inequalities that we know, characterize the Gilded Age. So I was reading about like Jane Addams in Chicago, who ran Hull House, and was just really impressed with how she instinctively knew that immigrant women, working women needed things like kindergarten, job training, postnatal care, child care. And I don't think I thought that Jane Addams' story necessarily could fit a novel, especially a historical mystery, but very quickly I came across the Bethany home in Minneapolis, which was a home for unwed mothers that was characterized by its commitment to treating unwed mothers with dignity and respect, and the belief that everybody deserved a second chance. They would provide prenatal and postnatal care, job training, a year of residency, room and board. And from what I could uncover, they did this without abusing the women or making them feel inferior or anything like that. So I thought, okay, this setting is really ripe for a story, but it didn't necessarily have conflict. So I looked into like what else was happening in Minneapolis at the time, and it turned out there was this incredibly well publicized at the time murder that happened in Minneapolis in 1894. May have been the work of our first confirmed serial killer, who would have been operating before H.H. Holmes in Chicago. So I thought, okay, how do these two intersect, or how can I make them intersect in a novel? And that was the genesis of this book.
And I think there's so much kind of like delicacy with the subject material as well. And I could tell, just by reading, I've learned so much about this period, which I knew very little about before. And I was sort of curious, as you dove into the historical context, did you use many like primary sources or archival material, or was it more so just like you imagined, you looked at photos, like what was the genesis of that?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate so Abby Mendenhall, whose point of view the first chapter takes, she was the treasurer of the Bethany home. Her complete journals and correspondence are in the public domain. So I read all of her letters and all of her journals. And I think initially, my editor is here, by the way, tonight, and she deserves a round of applause, too. She really helped me put this book together. We were initially unsure whether a reader would be able to relate to a Quaker woman in 1894. She's 63, she was Quaker. If you look at the photos of her, she appears very severe. But reading her journal, her personality really came alive for me. She was very playful and funny. She said things like, "I'm not sure if God can tell when I'm being sarcastic." And I read things like that. I thought, okay, she had a sense of humor about herself and some doubt, which I think makes a character of faith more relatable. She was always asking in her journals if God could please make her a better Quaker, because a lot of times she said she felt like a bad child. And she was very close with the women in the home. Sometimes I think too close to them. I think her boundaries were a little bit permeable, because she would do things like take the young women from the home if they were in distress,
she would have them come live with her. She would go around the city, like searching for women in trouble, searching for women who had left the home, who she thought might be in trouble. And from that, I kind of got a picture that like these women had become almost like her children, her surrogate children. So, so that was, I was really blessed to have that primary document to refer to. And the other piece of it was that through Abby's journals, I realized that she was a transplant from Cape Cod, and when she initially moved to Minnesota, she felt very homesick and kind of horrified by this frontier town that was still very muddy, unpaved roads, like logs were clogging the river. It was, she really, really missed being near the sea. And she wrote on her 37th birthday, I rarely have occasion to leave the house. My life at present is very monotonous. Isn't this supposed to be all that women aspire to have? And I thought, wow, you could tell that she really felt caged in. And then within 10 years, she and these other society women of Minneapolis had formed the Sisterhood of Bethany. And the first task that they completed was they bailed 2 madams out of jail. And then they brought the madams back to one of their houses, and she wrote something like, I was so excited we hardly knew what to do with ourselves. I thought that was really interesting. Not only that they were helping unwed mothers, but that they instinctively knew that they should help the madams as well. They were kind of allied. It was, a tenuous alliance, but they were standing up against the powers that be in the city, who were, of course, all men, to protect the women who were working in the red light districts, which I found fascinating.
Yeah, and I think the way you've written the Bethany House, it's a place of like real like friendship and solidarity, and also competition. And there's a kind of like, I thought you did such an incredible job showing this place where these women lived and cared for each other and kind of like let their hair down, and the kind of community that they formed. I was curious if there's anything in your research that surprised you about this particular period, that subverted any expectations you had about it.
Oh yeah, certainly a lot of things. I did try to present it as this place where these women were given a reprieve from having to take care of anyone other than themselves. I started to think about it, like what would it have been like to be granted a year, unconditional year in this home. And I thought, yeah, they would have let their hair down. They probably wouldn't have worn corsets. It would have been an interesting place. I think that one thing that really surprised me was the amount of political power that the Sisterhood of Bethany managed to have in the city. They managed to convince the city council to grant the Bethany home 2/3 of the fines that the city was levying against the brothels. So even though prostitution was technically illegal, there was a system of tacit approval where the city would round all of the madams and the sex workers up once a month, fine them, and then send them back to do what they were doing. So they were basically just taking a skim. And the Bethany Home founders very publicly, in newspapers and speeches, called this hypocrisy out and said, if you're going to allow these to continue to operate, you should give us 2/3 of the money, because we are actually housing and feeding and taking care of the women who become pregnant as a result, which of course happened a lot. And they were successful. And the fact that they couldn't actually vote or hold office, but they were able to secure this funding for their home, I think was amazing. And they outlasted mayor after mayor. The home was open for like 40 years. City council after city council, they held fast. And I love to tell stories like that, because we think of progress as being linear, but there are these periods of time where you find like extraordinary groups of people who were way ahead of their time.
Mm-hmm. I feel thinking about your previous 2 novels, that you have this incredible ability to sort of locate this subversive, surprising moments in history and write these novels that to me feel so fresh and contemporary, even though they're very grounded in a very specific historical moment. And I think what I really admire about your writing in general, one, it's like the lush, vivid, atmospheric prose, that we kind of feel it in that first page, right? We're like completely immersed in that world. But there's also this almost like wry, authorial narrative voice that's tempered with three very strong women characters and points of view in this novel. And you've talked about Abby so far, but I was wondering if you could introduce us to Faith and May as well, the types of women they are and what we were hoping to explore with their perspectives.
Sure. So Faith and May are two residents of the home, and they called them inmates. It didn't have a negative connotation in this context. So Faith is the new arrival in that first chapter. She arrives, she walks in, she's unannounced. Sometimes I think they knew when people were coming and going. Faith just shows up, she will barely speak, and she has bruises around her neck. So she's a mystery that everybody in the house wants to solve, and the rumor quickly spreads that she's actually this mesmerist that some of the girls have seen before in different parlors. That she went by Marguerite the Magnificent, but she will not confirm or deny this. However, the other women who live there begin to alter their behavior in certain ways, and they are blaming it on her. And then May is the roommate that Abby gives Faith. May has been there already for the full year, so she's due to leave. And she doesn't want to leave until she has a husband. So she's trying very hard to find a husband, and in essence to press the reset button on her life. Like she wants to pretend that this never happened, and to be able to go back to her family in Chicago with a respectable husband and have them accept her again. And we all know how unlikely that's going to be for poor May. So May seems like a stable force to Abby and someone who she can kind of trust to take care of Faith and to also look into Faith's background and figure out where she came from and why she arrived with a lot of money. But May is very unstable. She's the most unreliable of the three narrators. She's lying to herself, and she's lying to everybody around her about who she is and what she has seen and done. And so she ends up actually sort of pulling Faith closer into the darkness than Faith does to her.
Yeah, deception is such a prominent theme in the novel, and I mean, I've talked about the sort of like the incredible historical research and like grounding detail of the novel, but it's also like such a page turner and so gripping in this way that like there's a very, in my opinion, a very cathartic feel that takes place in this book, and a very strong mysterious element. And I was curious to know, I mean, we talked a little bit about mesmerism already and about the kind of powerful aspects of hypnotism. Why was it important for you to kind of bring in, alternative forms of belief in this novel, and to think through, again, these sort of subversive acts of belief and creation compared to what seemed at least a kind of strict ideological frame for that period?
Sure. Well, there were a lot of reasons to bring it in. One was the murder that I mentioned, and it's hard to go into detail about a true crime when it's part of the plot. So I won't give the plot away too much, but when this crime happened, it made national headlines, and what emerged was that the people surrounding the killer all claimed that he was a mesmerist. And they were shifting responsibility, as we were talking about earlier. He was this powerful mesmerist who could convince other people to do his bidding, even kill for him. And the public was primed to believe this because mesmerism had really taken hold of the public imagination in novels like Trilby by George du Maurier, which introduced the character of Svengali. That book came out that year and was the most popular book of the year. And also, I think we were talking about this earlier, but people coming out of the Civil War were motivated. Spiritualism of all shapes and all kinds was very popular because people wanted to believe that they could contact the dead. They had lost so many people in the Civil War, and also because technology had just made such a big shift forward in terms of communication. So the telephone, the telegraph had just been invented, and if you suddenly can believe in those forms of invisible communication, why not mind control? So I felt like I had to bring it in because I was talking about this particular crime, but also I didn't want him to be the only mesmerist in the book, and I wanted to kind of provide a female counterpoint to this person who could maybe get the better of him.
and use mesmerism or use her own powers of persuasion in, different ways, maybe more subversive ways. And it was important for her to be his exact structural opposite. So if the killer was a wealthy young man, privileged man, then she was going to be at the opposite end of society and be a woman who's working in a brothel and seemingly has no power, but she's given this great power of persuasion naturally.
Yeah, and it's so interesting how the theme of mesmerism and sort of belief and the power that you speak of also runs counter to this desire for love. Love is actually a really prominent theme in the novel, whether it's romantic love or love between solidarities that form between women. And I was interested in how the book kind of pushes up against the marriage plot in this way that I thought was really interesting. If you could speak a little bit about that too.
Sure. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think what I started to uncover in my research of the Bethany home, I was a bit skeptical at how often their stated mission was actually successful. Unfortunately, how often could, even though a big part of their ethos was that the unwed mothers were able to keep their children, which was extremely unusual then. It was even unusual in the Magdalen laundries 100 years later. But I had my doubts that too many of the women who left the Bethany home would have been able to go and successfully live as single mothers. It just seemed nearly impossible. But I applaud them for trying. So I think a lot of the women who went into the Bethany home were actually married. There was even a chapel in the Bethany home, and that the founders probably encouraged that as a way of moving on with your life and not returning to the brothels, a solution, a romantic solution. So in this book, I did not want that to be the solution, and clearly May believes that it is. I wanted to try to figure out ways that these women could leave the Bethany home without that being their only option, because it is sort of depressing to think of it that way, that despite their best efforts, they did have no control over the hourly wage of a seamstress as compared to monthly rent. And I think that was very hard as a young woman to live on your own as a factory worker or a seamstress in those days.
Yeah, and there's also this theme that runs throughout the book of sort of love being a form of hypnotism. And in some ways, I thought it was so just clever and crafty how love remained a common theme in the novel, but it wasn't in this sort of way that was very gendered. It was much more about sort of collective that was forming amongst the women and as they formed their own solidarities. And we use the term feminist now to describe books like this, but at the time that wasn't the term that was used. But I've noticed a strain throughout your work where it's really about often about women and their struggle for autonomy and agency. And I was wondering if you could kind of speak to that specifically about this book or just about your work in general.
Sure. Well, I like to think about how women have struggled, with that for millennia, and how they might have achieved some version of that in different periods of history. And I do really like to look at love between friends. I was inspired by the notion of the Victorian ghost story after I kept reading about how the women of the Bethany home would read aloud to each other in the parlor by the fire. And I know in Victorian times that people told ghost stories to remind themselves of how cozy they felt in their homes and with each other. And I wanted, particularly the character of May, to learn that the love she's so desperately seeking, because she hasn't gotten it from her family, can be found in a friend. And I certainly got that impression from Abby's journals, that she found love in this, they call themselves the Sisterhood of Bethany, and they did seem like they were a sisterhood. So I thought that was really powerful and feminist in its own way. I mean, well, they would have called it that.
Yeah, of course, yeah. I mean, like I said this earlier, but your work always strikes me as being very fresh and contemporary in its concerns. And as I was rereading the Mesmerist and thinking about our conversation tonight, I, of course, was thinking about our present moment. I was wondering if there were any lessons from the book that we could take from the past and bring to our present to better understand the world that we live in today.
Sure. Well, I think something I already touched on about the Sisterhood of Bethany was that they were very tenacious and they were loud. They spoke their minds. They were very unpopular with every single mayor and city council because they were saying things out loud that I really don't think those people were comfortable with. And I think they faced near shutdown many, many times. They were running low on funds, and every time they found a way to keep going. To me that feels like a lesson, and sometimes you don't, you have to find like sideways channels to stay true to your mission, but they did always manage to do it. Even in really, this book is set in 1894, which, interesting fact, it was 2 years into the only other non-consecutive second presidential term, Grover Cleveland. After he drove our country into a recession, that's when this book takes place. And now I do want to go back and read more about that. I don't know why, but I do. So they were facing tough times like everybody else, and I think a hostile mayor at that time too. And they found friends. I mean, they did rely on donations as well, and they would hold public speeches. Charlotte Van Cleve would give lectures, and they would charge people to come to these lectures, and then they would use that money to fund the Bethany home. And what she was talking about, we wouldn't call it this, or they wouldn't have called it this, but she talked about male privilege. Just came right out and talked about it. She said, Charlotte Van Cleve, another member of the Sisterhood of Bethany, famously said, "Where are the men who make these women what they are?" And then she said, "They're in our boardrooms, they're in our churches, and they're at our dining table." So I couldn't believe somebody said that out loud in the 1880s, and I really don't think it made her very popular. But I think she reached enough people who agreed with her that they would then donate to the home. So they managed to keep it going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so much about the book to admire, but one of the things besides like the prose, the incredible characters, like is the story itself, like the way that it subtly unfolds, and the kind of mastery of like composition. So I was curious to hear, as a fellow novelist, like how you plot and how you approach plotting, and also if you want to throw in any like tips for are there anyone here who writes like historical fiction? Okay, great. Just this thing I keep on harping on and on again about, but sort of plumbing deep into like a specific historical moment, but keeping it fresh and contemporary, and the concerns really grounded in today.
Thanks. Well, that is a huge compliment coming from you. And if you haven't read Camp Zero, now that is an expertly plotted, amazing, beautifully written book. I love her book. And it's also multiple points of view. Yeah. So I think we probably had a similar plotting process where you have to think about 3 different timelines and where they intersect and where you're going to check in with which character. In the case of this kind of historical fiction where I am dealing with some real people and real events, I did have a certain shape that was provided. That's one thing I think that can be nice about writing historical fiction, because it does give you a structure and gives you constraints that can be generative. So like I knew that this crime happened on December 3rd, 1894, and then I kind of like worked backward. Okay, well, what are the events and how do their 3 timelines lead up to this event? What can build to it? I typically plot pretty far into the book, and I just do that on handwritten or sometimes in like the notes app on my phone. I think plotting, I don't know about you, but I feel like plot points come to me when I'm not writing. Yeah. And it's like when you take a walk or a shower or something like that, and then you have to quickly jot it down. And then the hard work of writing, that ends up at the computer. But I think I typically write like a bad plot first, and then I add plot points to it that make it richer as I go. Mm-hmm. It just takes some time.
Was there anything that was, I'm thinking like, that didn't make it into the novel, or it was left out, or anything that you excised?
Yeah, there was a scene, Carolyn might remember. I think there was a scene I wrote that was just kind of boring, but it was based on, like a women's, might have been a women's suffrage meeting or something like that. Yeah, that I had in because I thought it was interesting. And then I realized, it didn't really further the plot at all. But yeah, it was a women's suffrage meeting. It could be tempting. You want to include everything that was happening in that moment because everything is interesting. Like you want to try to describe the entire world of 1894, and you just can't in one book about these particular people and this one crime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course with selection of detail as well to kind of build the tapestry of that world. I was actually really curious about your influences while you were writing, whether that was, other novels, literature, but also film, music even, or any other like art sources that you might have been looking at.
I was thinking about, well, you know what I was reading while I was writing this book? Because I do like to read a book that was written the same year as what I'm writing. So I read The Awakening by Kate Chopin.
Oh, great book.
And that was a great reference point for this novel. Just to live in the head of a woman who would have been a feminist in her moment and think about like what's rebellion to her? What is she chafing against? What does she not notice? Like what doesn't feel insulting to her, as a woman of 1894, and then also just for like language and details, clothing, food, all of that stuff, how people addressed each other. That I find that really valuable, and I usually try to avoid like a currently written historical fiction set in the same time because I don't want to accidentally copy it or take a bad detail or something like that. Like if you're reading The Awakening, everything is authentic.
Yeah, and actually that's so interesting that you're reading that. I can see thematically too certain influences streaming in such a positive way about sort of like awakening consciousness and like awareness of the body too. Yeah, that's a great touch point.
I think it did give me more, like remind me to write about the body because I thought I had been describing so much about like these women in the station and how they were feeling, but then I really thought like it's a home full of either women who are pregnant or women who have just given birth and babies, and like what would they all have felt like, and what would the place have smelled like? It was like it took me a little while to really think about that.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think like that visceral detail is what gives the book its sort of feeling of being sort of plunged into in the best possible way. I have one more question for you, and then open it to the audience. Okay, great. So I'll give you an option. Either like tell us a little bit about your writing day, or tell us next what you're working on, depending on what you feel.
I'll tell you about my writing day. It's changed. So I'll tell you about how I wrote my 3 books, because my first book took like 8 years to write, and I was working full time, and I had it in my head that I should just write like every Saturday, and I'll write 3,000 words. And that was not a great technique because the work goes cold during the week, and I can't sustain 3,000 good words. Like I have realized that the quality quickly goes downhill after 1,000 in a given day. So that was how I wrote my first book. And then The Lunar Housewife I wrote during COVID, and like early COVID I started it. Or no, I guess I had started earlier, but that was when I really picked up steam. And I had the kids home, my 2 daughters home all day, and I thought, I'm gonna write after they go to bed, and I'm gonna do it every single night, and I'm gonna write at least 1,000 words. And I'll follow Hemingway's advice and stop in the middle of a sentence or the middle of a scene, so that the next day I'll know exactly where to pick up. And that worked so beautifully, and I thought, I'm sure 1 million professors have told me to do this, but I never paid any attention. I'm like, well, you don't have to write every day, but that was the easiest that my work has ever flowed, was doing it at night and doing 1,000 words a day. And I think maybe I am a night owl, and that's probably when I get my best work done, but now I'm just too tired. And my kids go to school. So now I write, again, like 1,000 words a day. And I start at 8:30 and typically like done by 10, and then I do other work, other stuff.
Wow, that's an incredible schedule. I love that.
What's your schedule?
Much more erratic.
I mean, mine can be too, I'll be honest.
Intense, either like intense bursts of like just you sort of, feral writing, like no sense of time, and then, and then like periods of latency. But I like, for the book I'm working on now, I've instituted a schedule, and that's actually been like functional, but maybe less romantic. I don't know, it's hard to say.
It's true, it is less romantic.
Yeah.
I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. Any questions from the audience for Caroline?
Hi, Carolyn. Janice Robinson.
Hi,
there.
Janice.
Connected earlier. You mentioned early on when you started to talk about the book that you described it as historical mystery, not just historical fiction. And there does seem to be quite a few more subgenres coming out under historical fiction. Do you have any opinion as to why, particularly historical mystery, is starting to make some inroads and get noticed?
Yeah, why historical mystery is making inroads. I think the general thriller trend, it feels like people are really into thrillers in general right now, and it's funny, when I wrote The Lunar Housewife, I wasn't thinking of it as a historical thriller. I was thinking of it as a historical novel. And then the New York Times put it in the thrillers category, which was like, okay, interesting. And there is a death and a mystery, and there's some political, intrigue. And then I kind of took that and ran from there. I thought, okay, if this is the category that my work is being put in, I agree, and I'll go even further into the mystery territory now. I think we're seeing a lot of blended genres now, like romantasy and future and cli-fi. Like there's, and that's the kind of book I like to read too. I like historical fiction when it has a twist. Lunar Housewife has a book within a book. I always like I like historical that's blended with future. There are some books like that are really fun. So yeah, I don't know. People just seem to have an appetite for like mixed genres now.
Other questions from the audience?
Your characters, did you have your three-footed your characters from the beginning? We talked a little bit about Abby, I guess, being a real
Yeah.
person.
Did I have my three point of view characters from the beginning? I started with two actually. I wasn't gonna give Faith her perspective, and now that feels terrible to say. I thought she was gonna be mysterious, and I didn't see a way to tell the story from her point of view without like giving away her secrets. But you can. You just you don't. She doesn't say that part right away. She's repressing some things just like May is. So yeah, I think it started out with two points of view, and then very quickly I was like, I got to the end of an Abby or a May chapter and thought, oh, this is where Faith comes in. She's got to come in and say something. Yeah. Did you have a question?
I did, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer this without giving away the plot. So with that in mind, do you have a scene that you're particularly proud of, or a moment in the book that's just your favorite moment?
Oh yeah. Do I have a scene that I'm particularly proud of? I like the ghost story that I wrote. And I was like a little worried about including it because I thought, I hope people don't feel bored. But there is a scene in the book where two of the young women are out missing in a snowstorm, and everybody else is at the Bethany home. And Abby is there, and Abby is going to spend the night because she's worried about them, and that is really something Abby did, which made me wonder, like, what do her nightgowns look like? She would just spend the night.
Many frills.
Many
copious.
frocks,
Yeah.
yes, yes. So they would tell each other stories, and it's close to Christmas, and I thought, I want Miss Rhodes, the matron, to tell everybody a ghost story. And I wrote this ghost story on a really, really hot day in the Outer Banks, and it's about a frigid, cold, frozen lake. And I had a lot of fun writing that. So that's the part that I'm proud of. And it's come up a couple times at readings. I've had people say, like, I love the ghost story. Where did that come from? I'm like, yes.
So for your process, do you outline the entire book before you start writing, or you just kind of start sometimes and see what happens?
Do I outline the entire book before I start? I like to know what I'm writing toward, but it's usually a looser outline at the beginning, and things surprise me as I go. I think our professors said, a lot of us are going to remember this, like you should be, what did Leslie say, 73% sure of your ending. And I actually think that's kind of what I do. Yeah. And I basically know, like, this is the ending image maybe, and then I figure out how to get, from the very beginning to that.
Any other questions? I have a few more, but I just want to give the opportunity. Yeah.
Back to the gender piece, or no, oh, sorry. The I lost my word, but so you mentioned that you kind of like to write what you read a little bit, or the genre. I'm so sorry, that's one letter. Does that feel like a luxury or more like a burden, like that you get to like write within those realms that you get to also like feature in? And then also, has that kind of grown through your career? Like, do you kind of play it here, or what's that? Has that always been?
Oh, okay. So, like, if I'm writing the same thing that I enjoy reading, like, does that take away the pleasure of reading that genre?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I don't think so. And I try to mix up what I read a lot. Like, I read nonfiction or, futurist fiction, thrillers, mysteries. So, I still enjoy those kind of books. I do get jealous sometimes, of course. Like, you read something like, I could never write something this good. And then what was the second question? Does that evolve as I...
Yeah, like, did you start your career also in this genre?
Oh, yeah. My first published novel was historical. It's set in the Weimar Republic in Berlin. And it's more straight historical. There's a little bit of a mystery in it, but it's less like writing The Lunar Housewife and including a sci-fi novel inside the novel was a big leap from Fräulein M. But when I was at BU, I think some of the short stories I wrote were historical, so clearly that's always been an interest. I think I read all the American Girl books as a kid, so that's probably where that came from.
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah.
Hi.
Caroline. So I'm wondering if writing this book changed the way you think about the adjective mesmerizing, which is so often used in blurbs and reviews. As an author, as a novelist, you don't need the reader to do your bidding, I don't imagine, but you want the reader to go where you want them to go in their imagination. So I'm just curious about that.
That's true. Yeah, the word mesmerizing now jumps out at me every single place that I see it. And that's true. I mean, it is a compliment. You want your novel to be mesmerizing because you do want to immerse the reader in the world that you created, and you also want them to feel, you want it to be hypnotic. You don't want them to be distracted. But I think it's overused, for sure. And it's funny because where mesmerism comes from, it was this bogus system of healing invented in Germany in the 18th century by Anton Mesmer, who theorized that we all have these magnetic fluids coursing through our bodies, that somebody, a mesmerist or a magnetist, it was also called animal magnetism, could manipulate and heal you of certain things. And for it to go from that to his name being used as an adjective to describe a really fun book. It's it's amazing how it went all the way from point A to point B. So yes, that's an interesting question, because all this entire fall I keep seeing that word everywhere. Every single time I'm like, oh, haven't seen it applied to my book because I feel like it's just too on the nose. But yeah.
And also mesmerism in this book, it isn't really positive actually. It's sort of you're kind of subject to it, Whereas I in this way that seems like an affliction, as opposed to it being something that you kind of sink into and get pulled away. But great question. Any other questions? Audience? No? Let's just check the time. I wanted to ask about kind of your pivot, I mean, I guess I wouldn't say your pivot, because you always have been, a writer of historical fiction. But what is it about the past that calls you? I mean, I ask this from the perspective of someone who is literally a science fiction writer who only writes about the future. So I feel like we could have an interesting like past versus future conversation.
Yeah.
And I could never imagine writing historical fiction. Like, I feel like my brain doesn't work that way. But I have so much admiration for it. Tell me, what is it about the past that's so appealing?
That's a good question. And I actually love to read books set in the future. And I think that there's, I mean, even if they're dystopian, it's like you just want to know. Okay, if this is going to happen, it's like if you can anticipate what's coming, you think you can handle it better. The past, I really, I don't know. Maybe it's that I feel like we all haven't learned enough history, and that there are still so many things to uncover in the past. I do like, as a writer, I guess I like this, what I was talking about earlier, like the structure that it provides. And I feel, if I were to write a contemporary novel, I think I would feel kind of unmoored. What am I gonna, like, the boundaries are endless. Whereas if you pick like a time period, I feel like I have an assignment and I can go from there. And I also feel like good novels that happen to be historical are just the same as contemporary literary fiction. They're about, the human condition and relationships and a lot of things that, haven't changed that much. And then you just put it in a historical context, and it can help us understand things about our current moment a lot better. It can help us see that, like, as I was saying earlier, like, progress is not always linear. I think what drew me to write about the Weimar Republic was the extraordinary progress that they had made, especially in Berlin, for like women's equality, LGBTQ rights, and how that would be unexpected considering what happened during World War II. But that some of that had seemed to have been forgotten. So yeah, I don't know. I like reading about the past, and then I just can't help but write about it.
Yeah, it's also the long view, right? Like, there's like that's the gaze is like across a great distance. And when I was wondering about that too, in terms of your creation of character, where there is this very it's not omniscient, because you are like embedded in this third person, but there is this sense of sort of looking down upon this world that you've created. And I was curious, have you ever been drawn to writing first person? I could sort of imagine that in some ways.
I did first person in The Lunar Housewife. Yeah, and that's one perspective throughout the whole book. And I don't know what drove me to do first person in that one and third in this book. I think it just was like subconscious that like this is what feels right. And I like what you just said about the long view, because any historical novel contains everything that came after it. Like, it's going to be in the back of our minds as we read. So we're going to be thinking about like 1894, but also 1919 and 1945, because you can draw the line from this book to your current moment. And one thing that I like to think about, and obviously there's no way to include this in the book, but I want readers to be thinking about it, is where will these characters go in the years that follow? So like, this book closes in 1895, and two of the main characters are still in their 20s. And I like to imagine, like, where are they going to be at the turn of the century? Where are they going to be during World War I? Like, even there's a baby at the end of the novel. Like, he probably fought in World War I if he was real. But I like to think about that, and with the Lunar Housewife ends in 1955, and I was thinking about like the role of the CIA. It was about the role of the CIA in the Cold War. But when I imagine the future lives of those characters, I was thinking all of this classified stuff is going to come to light, and how are their relationships going to change when things are confirmed? So maybe that's also why I like historical, because it feels like your book kind of has a long tail, in the imagination. where you can project what happens to these characters after the last page.
Yeah, and you can kind of revisit those narrative arcs too at different points and sort of see them differently, also depending on where you are as well. There's a kind of reciprocal aspect to it. Whereas I feel like with a novel that's set in the future, it's all projection. You know, like what will happen? Could it be this? And that timeline changes depending on the current events. So it's a kind of different kind of instability. But there's something about the past and back where it's like, oh, this happened concretely, and now we're here, but our interpretation of it changes, and so the perspective shifts in a way. I was thinking about that as well. Yeah, it's such an incredible novel. Thank you so much for writing it. And if you haven't grabbed a copy of it, please do. It's just a real treat and perfect for like creepy kind of November. Winter's coming, energy, so that's perfect for the season. Yeah.
And I want to put in a plug for Camp Zero because it is set in the future. It is dystopian, but also full of hope and female empowerment, and I loved it. It's like a major page turner, and I highly recommend that you read it.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks,
Thank you.